Good morning. My name is Justin Miche. I'm the coordinator of Veteran Services here at Montgomery County Community College, and I want to thank you for coming out today. Before I begin, I'd just like to say some thanks, obviously to President Stout for all her support to our student veterans, Dr. Swanson, Dr. Vasilio, and the other student affairs staff, along with the other faculty and staff members here at Montgomery County Community College for their continued dedication to our student veterans. I'd also like to thank Sergeant Robinson and Staff Sergeant Denman, who are out of Lansdale Recruiting Center, for coming out and helping out the Color Guard. I'd also like to thank, from the United States Marine Corps, Sergeant Andrade and Sergeant Landing. Sergeant Andrade is from the recruiting station in Harrisburg, and Sergeant Landling is actually a student here at Montgomery County Community College. This morning, we're going to take some time to do what is known as a new college initiative called the National Remembrance Day Roll Call. It's a continuation of a nationwide effort begun in 2011 to annually honor and recognize the sacrifice of this generation of heroes. In 2011, approximately 138 colleges and universities from all 50 states participated in a simultaneously reading of the names of those who paid the ultimate price for freedom in both Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. The national goal of Roll Call is to make Veterans Day a special time of appreciation and reflection on as many college campuses as possible. So today, I'd like to take some time and just read the names of those that have served and gave the ultimate sacrifice here in the state of Pennsylvania. I'll begin with the United States Army. Captain Christopher Seifert, Sergeant Donald Oakes, Captain Tristan Aitken, Staff Sergeant Stephen Booker, Specialist Michael Gleason, Specialist Zachariah Long, First Sergeant Christopher Coffin, Private First Class Corey Small, Sergeant Jared Coronado, Specialist William Marr, Private First Class Timmy Brown, Specialist Craig Ivory, Sergeant Eric Hull, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Sherman, Specialist Raphael Navia, Captain Brian Fonts, Sergeant Andrew Baddock, Staff Sergeant Christopher Cutchall, Specialist Tamara Ramos, Specialist Douglas Weissmantel, First Lieutenant David Bernstein, Staff Sergeant Paul Sweeney, Specialist Maurice Johnson, Sergeant Ernest Bucklew, Sergeant Nicholas Tomko, Sergeant Joseph Minucci, Sergeant Timothy Hayslett, Staff Sergeant Kimberly Voles, Sergeant Christopher Golby, Specialist William Sturges, Specialist Edward Baberon, Specialist Clint Matthews, Sergeant Matthew Sandry, Sergeant Sean Mitchell, Specialist Jonathan Kephart, Staff Sergeant Edward Carmen, Specialist Martin Condor, Private First Class Bradley Kritzer, Staff Sergeant Jeremy Horton, Private Bradley Coleman, Specialist Sean Davies, Sergeant Dale Lloyd, Specialist Nicholas Zangara, First Lieutenant Neil Santorello, Sergeant Brandon Adams, Specialist Joshua Henry, Specialist Gregory Cox, Specialist Rodney Jones, Sergeant Andrew Brown, Private First Class Aaron Rusin, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Flan, Staff Sergeant Sean Hui, Sergeant Joe Nolan, Sergeant First Class Paul Kopowich, Specialist Michael Smith, Sergeant Brett Swank, Private Landon Giles, Private First Class Michael Franklin, Staff Sergeant Thor Ingram, Sergeant Andrew Joden, Private First Class Kenneth Ziegler, Staff Sergeant Victor Cortez, Private First Class Douglas Kashmir, Specialist Robert Hall, Private First Class Nils Thompson, Sergeant Jeremy Campbell, Staff Sergeant Troy Erznak, Major Jeff Tokowski, Private Dylan Pates, First Lieutenant Michael Cleary, Private Travis Zimmerman, Private First Class Stephen Snowberger, Master Sergeant Thomas Mahalik, Sergeant First Class Scott Smith, First Sergeant Christopher Rafferty, Captain Jason West, Specialist Tristan Smith, Private First Class Justin Dries, Sergeant Jennifer Hartman, Sergeant Alan Beavington, Corporal Carl Johnson, Staff Sergeant Joseph Kane, Specialist Timothy Lower, Second Lieutenant Christopher Loudon, Corporal Russell Culbertson, Sergeant First Class Tony Kinnear, Chief Warrant Officer John Priestner, Private First Class Albert Nelson, Private Ross McGinnis, Sergeant Brent Drunkelberger, Sergeant J. Moon, Sergeant John Bubeck, Sergeant Edward Schaefer, Private David Dietrich, Sergeant Thomas Vandling, Sergeant First Class Keith Callahan, Captain Mark Resch, Sergeant Russell Kurtz, Private First Class Matthew Bowe, Specialist Luis Contreras, Private Wesley Williams, Sergeant Ashley Moyer, Private First Class Orlando Gonzalez, Sergeant Curtis Forshee, Specialist Jason Schaefer, Private First Class Aaron Geneve, Staff Sergeant Stephen Tudor, First Lieutenant Colby Umbrella, Sergeant Alan Dunkley, Private First Class Robert Dembowski, Master Sergeant Arthur Lilly, Private First Class Larry Parks, Sergeant First Class Raymond Buchan, Specialist Zachary Klauser, Specialist Cami Florexi, Specialist Michael Hook, Sergeant First Class Michael Tully, Captain Eric Foster, Sergeant Jan Argnish, Master Sergeant Scott Ball, Sergeant First Class David Cooper, Private First Class Adam Chickjen, Staff Sergeant Patrick Kushbach, Captain David Boris, Staff Sergeant Ryan Masteth, Sergeant Timothy Van Orman, Specialist Luke Runyon, Captain Nathan Radishbush, Sergeant First Class Sean Zook, Specialist Jason Zarek, Private Matthew Brown, Private First Class Joshua Waltenbog, Private First Class James Yon, Sergeant Douglas Bull, Second Lieutenant Michael Gerardo, Private Michael Dinterman, Chief Warrant Officer Michael Sobaldnik, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Marino, Private First Class Christopher Lauder, Staff Sergeant Mark Small, Staff Sergeant William Vile, Specialist Chad Edmondson, Sergeant Josh Rimmer, Corporal Jonathan Walls, Sergeant Andrew McConnell, Specialist Ross Vogel, Private First Class Brandon Steyer, Staff Sergeant Glenn Stivison, Private First Class Serge Kripovic, Sergeant First Class Michael Shannon, Sergeant Nathan Kennedy, Staff Sergeant Richard Timon, Private First Class David Jefferson, Specialist Luis Fataku, Specialist Jesse Reed, Specialist Joshua Harton, Staff Sergeant David Weigel, Specialist Dale Caridlo, Specialist Anthony Vargas, Staff Sergeant Sean Flannery, Specialist Jared King, Sergeant Robert Sisson, Captain Wesley Hinkle, Private First Class John Kim, Sergeant First Class Benjamin Bittner, First Lieutenant Demetrius Frizen, Staff Sergeant Edward Mills, Sergeant First Class Kenneth Ewell, Captain Michael Braden, Private First Class Cameron Stambaugh, Staff Sergeant Brandon Pepper, Staff Sergeant Eric Holman. I'll now read the list from the United States Army National Guard. Sergeant Christopher Geiger, Sergeant Sherwood Baker, Sergeant Carl Curran, Specialist Mark Kasich, Specialist Clifford Moxell, Specialist Brent Hershey, Sergeant Carl Morgan, First Lieutenant Luis Allen, Sergeant Bram Jeffcoat, Specialist Kurt Kraut, Sergeant Francis Straub, Specialist Gennaro Pellegrini, Specialist John Kulik, Private First Class Nathaniel DeTample, Staff Sergeant Ryan Ostrom, Specialist William Evans, Sergeant William Fernandez, Staff Sergeant Daniel Arnold, Sergeant Eric Slabonik, Staff Sergeant George Pulgisi, Specialist Lee Weingant, Private First Class Oliver Brown, Staff Sergeant Daniel Littner, Sergeant First Class Brent Adams, Staff Sergeant Keith Bennett, Lieutenant Colonel Michael McLaughlin, Sergeant First Class Randy McCauley, Specialist Frederick Carlson, Specialist Mark Melcher, Staff Sergeant David Viverick, Sergeant First Class Daniel Bravokich, Master Sergeant Sean Thomas, Specialist Jeremy Marsh, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Berenti, First Lieutenant Jeffrey Demprimo, Private First Class Derek Holland, Private First Class Jonathan Lusher, Staff Sergeant Mark Baum, Staff Sergeant Brian Hoover, Sergeant First Class Robert Fike, Sergeant Brian Mowry, Staff Sergeant Kenneth Van Giesen, Sergeant Edward Kohler, Chief Warrant Officer 2, Jarrett Yoder, Chief Warrant Officer 3, Matthew Ruffner. I'll now read the names of those KIA'd from the United States Marine Corps. Private First Class James Dillon, Lance Corporal Joseph Maglione, Lance Corporal Eric Barr, Gunnery Sergeant Ronald Baum, Corporal John Todd, Lance Corporal Nicholas Morrison, Corporal Barton Humlands, Sergeant Lonnie Wells, Corporal Michael Cohen, Corporal Kyle Rinhan, Corporal Kyle Grimes, Sergeant Michael Marzano, Lance Corporal Robert Menninger, Private First Class Joshua Klinger, Staff Sergeant Joseph Goodridge, Lance Corporal Ryan Kovacek, Private First Class Jason Fry, Lance Corporal Patrick Kenny, Lance Corporal Stephen Swidek, Corporal Albert Gettings, Captain Brian Willard, Sergeant James Fordet, Sergeant Jonathan McCauley, Lance Corporal Jacob Beisel, Staff Sergeant Eric McIntosh, Corporal Brandon Hardy, Lance Corporal Adam Conboy, Private First Class Stephen Freund, Private First Class Shelby Finelio, Lance Corporal Brandon Van Paries, Captain Todd Seibert, Lance Corporal Dennis Veter, First Lieutenant Travis Mannion, Lance Corporal Travis Slotmeyer, Sergeant David Wallace, Corporal Anthony Williams, Lance Corporal Robert Ulmer, Sergeant Michael Heed, Sergeant Ryan Lane, Staff Sergeant Matthew Ingram, Staff Sergeant Larry Johnson, Sergeant Derek Shanfield, Sergeant Joseph Caskey, Lance Corporal Abram Howard, Lance Corporal Joshua Twig, Lance Corporal Ralph Fabry, Corporal Eric Torbert, Lance Corporal Peter Clore, Sergeant Joseph Garrison, Staff Sergeant Patrick Dolphin, Sergeant Christopher Winkle, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Rabble. Now I'll read the names for the United States Navy. Petty Officer 3rd Class John Freilish, Petty Officer 3rd Class Roger Napper, Chief Petty Officer Michael Koch, Aviation Boatsmate Daniel Verbeck, Cryptologist Technician Michael Strange, Petty Officer 1st Class Nicholas Check, Commander Job Price. I'll now read the names of the United States Air Force. Staff Sergeant David Uyghur, Airman 1st Class Austin Gates, Staff Sergeant Justin Schmalstag, Airman Daniel Zerb, and Senior Airman Brian Bell. The color guard will please come and remove the colors. Thank you all for coming out and reflection of this event, and have a happy Veterans Day. Thank you.